All right, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Kara Circle. Kara Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books. And Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are also, of course, the school store for Agnes Scott College. I also have the honor of guest lecturing sometimes in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies department. And so it is a great honor to begin our semester with this event this afternoon. We are celebrating the work of Dr. Roshan Iqbal, and she is here in conversation with Dr. Reem Beloni for a discussion of marital and sexual ethics in Islamic law, rethinking temporary marriage. So if everyone can applaud for that. It is always our pleasure to get to co-host events with Agnes Scott College, and specifically with the Religious Studies department in this case. So I'll introduce Reem first. Dr. Reem Beloni is a historian of modern Middle East with a focus on Middle East migrations and transnationalism. Her research explores the history of Syrian Lebanese diaspora politics during the interwar period. Her book, Transnational Rebellion, The Syrian Revolt of 1925 to 1927, and the Syrian Lebanese Diaspora, forthcoming from Edinburgh University Press, explores the diasporic and transnational dimensions of the Syrian Revolt of 1925 to 1927, which was a watershed moment in anti-colonialism during the French Mandate era. The book situates the history of the 1925 Syrian Revolt in the broader internationalism of the 1920s. Dr. Beloni's second project will explore the history of Syrian-Lebanese transnational family dynamics after World War I and how migrant families parented and educated their children in the diaspora as part of a broader project in constructing their national selves. So please welcome Dr. Beloni. And the woman of the hour is Dr. Roshan Iqbal. She hails from a small hamlet of 20 million, Karachi, Pakistan. She received her PhD in Islamic Studies from Georgetown University. Prior to this, she read for her MPhil at the University of Cambridge. She has studied in Pakistan, the US, Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, the UK, and Iran. Her research interests include gender and sexuality in the Qur'an, Islamic law, film and media studies, and modern Muslim intellectuals. Her most recent book, which we are celebrating today, is Marital and Sexual Ethics in Islamic Law. And as an associate professor at Agnes Scott College, she teaches classes in the Religious Studies department and also classes that are cross-listed with Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Film Studies. When she is not working, she loves talking to her family and friends on the phone. Thank you, unlimited phone plans. Tracking fashion, sartorial flourishes are such fun. Watching films, love, love, love. Reading novels, never enough. Painting watercolors, less and less poorly. And cooking new dishes, sometimes successfully. And you can see by the beautiful spread that she has offered out on the porch for your enjoyment that food is an important part of her celebration. So thank you for providing that hospitality for us, Roshan. So we do want to let folks know, whether you're watching virtually or if you're physically here with us, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. If you're physically here, I will bring the microphone to you for accessibility reasons. So please wait till I get to you before you start speaking. And if you are watching virtually at home, I will vocalize your question if you put it in the chat. So without further ado, I am going to pass it over to our esteemed guests. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Can you all hear me? All right, good. I want to start off by thanking Karis Books for hosting us and always providing an intellectual space for us to gather, to talk, to discuss, to think, more importantly, and to really just, be creative in our intellectual lives. I also want to thank the department, the Religious Studies department, as well as Middle Eastern Studies, for kind of hosting these conversations. And more importantly, I want to thank all of you for being here today for this, what should be a really exciting conversation. I am so honored to be sitting beside this brilliant woman who I've known for the past 6 going on 7 years. And I'm sure that all of you will have so much to learn from today's conversation. So I don't want to, take too much time. I just kind of want to jump right into it. So Dr. Iqbal, could you start off by sharing your intellectual journey with us? What initially drew you to the field of Islamic studies? And how did you ultimately come to this specific topic of your book?
Much like Dr. Berluni, I would like to start by thanking Karis for hosting this book launch event, and especially ER. He's been really helpful. I've been like panicky, emailing him back and forth, and he's like, relax, lady. Everything is going to be okay. I'd like to thank Dr. Scarlett Kinsley. She was the one who spearheaded organizing this talk. Dr. Berluni for being my conversation partner. I would like to thank Abby, who's been a superstar in helping me bring the catering here. And she's a religious studies major, so we love her a lot. I'd like to thank Leah for always making beautiful posters. I'd like to thank Dr. Jim Diedrich for taking pictures so that this can be immortalized. I don't know if I have another book in me, so this is really important. I would like to thank my students, old and new, for coming here today. My colleagues, old and new, for coming today. My colleagues from Emory and Georgia Tech who are here. I'd like to thank everybody who's online. And I'd like to thank some other people who are not like really in academia, but are here. They've taken time off from their work, who are doctors. Could be making a lot of money right now, but are here, unlike some others, And I'd like to thank everybody who's online. I am a truly, truly blessed individual with so many people here to support me. To answer your question, Dr. Berluni, in terms of my intellectual journey, so I didn't originally plan to do a PhD in Islamic studies. When I came abroad for my undergrad, one of the stipulations my parents put was that you have to do something practical, something in which you will actually make a living. So my major was economics, and I was thinking of going to graduate school in economics and doing a PhD in economics. But even then, what I was thinking was I would do something like Islamic finance. But when I went to this terminating master's program in economics at Tufts, I realized that what I had in mind in terms of what economics is not what I would be doing. What I was doing in my classroom and what I understood to be doing if I did my PhD in economics would be studying mathematical models, which is really interesting and challenging, but that was not what I was thinking. I was thinking something entirely different. So during my graduate program at Tufts, I had the ability to take an elective in the history department, and I took a class on religion and secularity. And this class was taught by Dr. Aisha Jalal, who is a Pakistani woman. And it was in that class that fireworks went off in my head. And I was just like, wow, this is something I want to think about. And then when you sort of try to connect the dots in your own kind of intellectual journey, I knew that even with economics, what I was trying to do was to find Islam continues with modernity while being critical of modernity. So when I started to think that I might do a PhD in Islamic studies, it was kind of late for me because I didn't have any of the languages. But the idea was that I would try to think about like gender justice related issues. And then like coming up, the topic of temporary marriage was like something that happened by chance. I was visiting family friends in Toronto, and someone mentioned something about temporary marriage, and I was like, what is that? And when they explained it to me, which I will give details later, I was really surprised, and I thought, like, this is something I kind of want to study. This falls into the realm of gender, things related to gender and Islam. So yeah.
Fitting. Your book is titled Marital and Sexual Ethics in Islam, Rethinking Temporary Marriage. So given that we have such a diverse and lovely audience here today, could you please begin by defining temporary marriage?
So I'll begin by saying that in Islam, 2 types of marriages exist. One is polygyny. So a Muslim man can be married to 1 or 4 for women at the same time. And then there is a minority sect in Islam that also allows for temporary marriage. A temporary marriage is a type of marriage where, like, when you are getting married, there's a formula you read, and the formula is something like I, X, marry you, Y, and at this point you say the time. Is it 3 days, 3 weeks, 10 days, 10 years, 99 years? And for a particular gift. So this gift can be a fistful of grain of rice, or it can be $10,000 or $2 billion. $2 billion looks good. And so that would be like, it's a very simple thing. And so as you were hearing the definition, maybe you were getting some kind of like, when I heard about it the first time, I was like, wow, this is like really close to what prostitution looks like, what is going on. There are some similarities between temporary marriage and prostitution, but there are also major differences. And the major difference being that if a woman in this marriage was to conceive a child, the child would get the father's name and have inheritance rights. So this would be like, I think we'll talk a little bit more about temporary marriage as we go on, but this is like sort of the bare bones of the definition.
And the Arabic word for temporary marriage is muta. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Arabic word for temporary marriage is muta, which is derived. So if you know a little bit about Arabic, you know that Arabic has tripartite roots. Each word can be derived into three roots, and the root comes from pleasure. So the word muta, the roots come from pleasure.
Interesting. I hope we get a chance to talk about that a little bit later, but to kind of maintain this, for the sake of maintaining this conversation and kind of establishing a meaningful baseline for our discussion, could you share the main findings of your book just at the outset?
Okay, so my book asks two questions. So one of the things that got me interested was, okay, so there's this institution. How have Muslim scholars derived the permissibility of this institution? So the first question my book asks is, and so then I learned that there's a verse in the Qur'an, 4.24, which is what Muslim scholars use to derive the permissibility. So the first question my book asks is, can this verse actually be used as a precursor to the permissibility of temporary marriage? And I answer this question by looking at tafsir, which is exegesis or explanation of verses in the Quran. So I take the verse that is used as the permissibility, which is 4.24, and I do an intellectual history of a lot of the commentaries that have been written on this verse over time. So from the first extant work we have up until now. So that's how I answer the question, can this verse be used? And my findings are that actually this verse has polysemy and ambiguity. Polysemy being there are various and different meanings that can be derived from this verse. And ambiguity means that it is not clear cut that you can use this verse for the permissibility. So then I come to the second question, which really is like my underlying motivation to study this institution was, if we cannot decide on the basis of this verse if temporary marriage is permissible or not, what other things can be used to think about, excuse me, to think about this institution? And then, but I didn't want to just think about it in any which way. I wanted to think about it and making it continuous with the Islamic tradition and thinking about marital and sexual ethics alongside it. So that's the second question that my book asks, and that's personally my main intervention, or some things that I'm really excited about that I kind of got to read and think and write about in this book.
Thank you. So before we actually move on to the next question, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about in what context people practice temporary marriage.
So historically, we don't have any record of this type of marriage being practiced. Historically, it's been people on the margins that have ever practiced it. So imagine that if only 15% of Muslims are Shia, but Shias have three branches, so Zaydis, Ismailis, and Asharis, and only one of the branch permits it. So you can imagine that is a very small population. And even from that, it's not something that was historically socially acceptable. So it was not something that was being practiced. It became something that was practiced in modernity because when Ayatollah Khomeini came into power, when the Iranian Revolution happened, there was a 10-year war between Iran and Iraq. And that meant that there was it created a gender imbalance where a lot of men lost their lives in this war. And then we had, there was a birth rate issue. There was a gender issue. So there were more women in the population than there were men. So Ayatollah Khomeini is the first person in modernity who introduced temporary marriage into society. One of the ways in which he did it was he put it in textbooks, for example. I grew up a Shia. I did not know what temporary marriage was. But when it became it was needed as a tool, he introduced it into textbooks. On Jummah khutbahs, people started talking about it and promoting it. And so in modernity, we have seen it only in times of war and crisis. And now, very recently, it is appearing in the Sunni world in terms of people who consider themselves to be practicing Muslims, but also want to partake in dating and physical relations. So then they are told that there is this thing, you could have a temporary marriage, you could live with this person, you could, so that's how it's showing up in modern times. Yeah.
Very interesting. So as I learned from reading your book, this context of war was also historically where the idea came from or was practiced, where the Prophet Muhammad, at least according to certain traditions, permit temporary marriage when men were at war and battle. And so it's interesting to see it come back and return in a modern context for those very same reasons. That's super interesting. I want to kind of move on to talk about interventions. What major contributions or interventions does your work make in the wider field of Islamic studies? How are you intervening in these broader discussions and debates and methodologies?
So Western academia has been historically very focused on Sunni knowledge production. And I think just by virtue of focusing on an institution that is central to Shia Islam, I think that in itself makes me a unique voice, because there are texts and material and literature that has not been looked upon or has been marginalized just because it didn't belong to the mainstream Sunni knowledge production. So that's one way in which I'm doing it. And I don't just stop at Shia sources. I go further and I look at works by minor schools like Ibadi, Ashari, Zaidi, and Ismaili. And these schools have been largely neglected by Western scholars. So I feel there is somewhat of a contribution I'm making in this. There is another bias in Western academia that it privileges Arabic and Arabic sources. So one of the things that my book is doing is it also looks at Persian and Urdu sources. So this is kind of a contribution to the field too. My work on the intellectual history of exegesis draws from all available genres in exegesis. So you could, for example, look at works that only look at grammatical exegesis or look at linguistics, but my work tries to draw from all available genres. So it presents an intellectual history that's diverse in that sense too. One of the main things, and this is not something new that I'm doing, but I think that it's really important that it be shown in different areas in Islamic studies, which is that I show through looking at the lives of the exegetes and then the explanation or exegesis they write on this verse, that where a scholar is born, when a scholar is born, that scholar is in a dialectic with his or her larger environment. And the work of tafsir, which Muslims tend to sort of imagine to be outside of time and place, is actually very much in time and place, and they're responding to what is happening around them and what the questions are. So I think my work also sort of shows this aspect. And it's not the first to show it, but I think it's an important thing to be reiterated. My work is because of my advisor was a German scholar, she really trained me in philology. So my work is very strongly philological, but it's also prescriptive. So I think that that's an interesting, I mean, it's prescriptive and it's interdisciplinary in a very, very real way. So I think those are sort of contributions to the field.
Yeah, and also as I learned, your book or your work is the first to comprehensively study this particular topic, the topic of multi-marriage, specifically through tafsir or through the study of Quranic verses. So I want to ask you a question before we move on. Who is traditionally considered a scholar of tafsir, who produces tafsir, and how does your book approach that differently?
So, excellent question. I forgot. So traditionally, if a scholar writes a whole exegesis on the entire Quran, then they are considered a scholar of tafsir or a scholar of Quran. One of the things that I do in my book is I try to, so men have had the luxury of doing this over time. I try to incorporate women who may not have had a written tafsir. So for example, one of the scholars I look at is Farhat Hashmi, who is a scholar from Pakistan. She doesn't have a written tafsir as in it's in a bounded text, but she has read or lectured a commentary on the entire Quran. So I use that, her work as, and consider it tafsir. So that would be the way in which I differently approach.
Fascinating. Since we have a lot of students in our audience, thank you all for being here today. Could you tell us a little bit about the outline of your book, how the chapters are divided, the organizing logic you chose, and why?
So my book, and this is something I always sort of try to talk to my students about the process of writing, and not just the content, but also like how is it structured, what was the author thinking about. So my book has 5 chapters. The first chapter is an introductory chapter where if you read that chapter, you would learn about like pre-Islamic Arabia, how was temporary marriage practiced there, what other kind of marriages existed. Then you would sort of see like how it exists in contemporary period, and you would like learn a lot about like its practice, its history, and the context in which it was there. And then you would like sort of learn about like, oh, there are feminists who are pro-temporary marriage, and there are feminists who are against temporary marriage. So, and I'll talk about that when we talk about the first chapter. And then the second, third, and fourth chapter is where I do what in Islamic studies is considered philological work. Each chapter takes 500 years of exegesis, and I sort of like read those texts for the reader, and then I sort of lay it with a commentary, and I provide for every scholar that I use, when was he born, where did he study, what were the sort of larger historical context. So it would be very interesting for our students and our since Agnes, we consider ourselves a global, like we center ourselves around like global studies, that if you read these scholars, you would be amazed at how much they traveled to study. Like it boggles your mind, like how they went from like Turkey to Saudi Arabia to like Turkmenistan, like they traveled to study with scholars. And it's like, we consider ourselves international, but really they were international without like considering themselves international. So if you read the middle 3 chapters, you would sort of see, you would be able to contextualize the work of exegesis of tafsir in the life of this scholar. The final chapter takes its title from the book, which is like Rethinking Marital and Sexual Ethics in Islamic Law, and makes 4 interventions. And maybe like that's something we can talk about in detail maybe.
Sure, yeah. It's fascinating that, these scholars that you write and think about really did inhabit a different geography. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the sense that the geography was entirely shaped by their pursuit of knowledge, whereas today, like the geography that we kind of used to travel as one determined by like, where does Delta fly, and kind of, what kind of deals can I get? So it's really interesting to think about the pre-modern world, how that has kind of shaped the world we live in today, and how also we've radically departed from that.
Mm-hmm. And they took pains to do this. It was not easy. You could die on a journey from here to there.
Definitely. Well, now that we kind of have a bird's eye view of your book and your work, could you share with us some of the key insights and takeaways that you think our audience today should really walk away with?
So, I mean, from the first chapter, what I would say is that I think when I was prescribing temporary marriage, I didn't sort of say that it is also used for non-sexual purposes. So, for example, if you come from a religious family where gender segregation is a thing, and these two families want to travel, so one member of the family, it could be someone who's 80 years old, would like do a temporary marriage with another member of the other family, and by doing this temporary marriage, they would then not have to gender segregate, and they could travel together. Another way in which temporary marriage is being used is for reproductive purposes. So, for example, if someone is married and their wife cannot have a child, then the man could have a temporary marriage with somebody, and it would be their surrogate mother, and that would it facilitates reproductive purposes. Then I think in the first chapter, what you would learn is like, what is the argument feminists who are pro temporary marriage give? And basically the argument they give is that temporary marriage depoliticizes sex. And this obsession that people have over virginity can be will get diluted over time. The feminists who are against temporary marriage say that it has the potential to destroy families and public morality. And this is not justified in Islam, and that there is potential for abuse of women. And all of this sort of adds layers of complexity to evaluating temporary marriage. The feminists who are against it, they note that such marriages are the prerogative of rich men. And who are they marrying? They're marrying poor, divorced, widowed women. And these women, since this marriage is not registered anywhere, these women do not have any legal recourse if something untoward was to happen. So these would be the things and like you might learn that, for example, not in the Islamic context, but Mexico has some kind of idea about temporary marriage where they say that you can be in a marriage that is for 2 years, and then the marriage after 2 years will dissolve itself. And you don't need to go to the courts or do any legal work because there's too much pressure on courts to actually process this type of this thing. So, and it is like temporary marriage is sort of showing up in a lot of countries, including the US and like the Western world. So those were the things you would probably learn about if you looked at the first chapter.
Interesting. When I was reading the book, I found that the middle 3 chapters really kind of delved more specifically into the realms of grammar, rhetoric, linguistics, basically the ways in which tafsir specialists or scholars of the Qur'an kind of use to interpret the Qur'an and try to understand it better. Is there any aspect of any of these middle 3 chapters that you believe would be valuable for a broader audience? And what should we know about how these ways of interpreting the Qur'an developed over time, and how did these techniques kind of change how scholars understood muta over time?
Mm-hmm. So at this, in one of my classes, we are looking at a book on the Quran, and I wanted to invite like maybe some of my students to speak on how do Muslims, what is the importance of the Quran to Muslims? And then I will get to your question. Does anybody want to be so brave as to, I'm just going to call on somebody. Victoria, would you like to say?
I think that for Muslims, Quran is literally words from God, and they truly believe that it's from God, not fabricated by someone. It's the main source that they believe that it's legal one. So I think that it's
So
a
that
important thing.
Muslims believe that it is the literal word of God, it's divine speech, and when they take this speech really seriously, it's supposed to guide them in their life. Islamic law is an extension of that idea. Thank you, Victoria. So I think from the middle three chapters, which, like you said, are very kind of, I mean, it's hard. I wouldn't read it if I didn't have to. But, you know, the field requires that kind of philological work. I would say that one of the things that I am doing is in the first chapter, in the second chapter, that's the first of the middle three chapters, I treat Aisha, which is the wife of the Prophet, as an exegete. She has not historically been treated as an exegete. The reason why I treat her as an exegete is firstly that we have to recover the voices of women from our past. They are there, we have to find ways to recover. I treat her as an exegete because at this point, at the start of Muslim history or intellectual production, there was no such thing as tafsir. So when the Prophet passed away, there was the Qur'an. People had like his sayings, which are like the hadith. When they had a question, they would either like ask somebody, has the Prophet said something about it? And there were a few people that had been around the Prophet a lot, so they remembered what the Prophet had said. Aisha, when the Prophet passed away, was only 18, and she lived for another 46 years. So she like had the most like memory of him. And in the canonical text of Sunni Islam, 1/3 of the sayings of the Prophet come from her. And when I was going through her, like all the hadiths, I wanted to say, has she said something on temporary marriage? Like, is there something that I could use and then include her as an exegete? And actually, she does have some, she's at some point is asked about the types of marriages that existed in pre-Islamic Arabia. And she has a list of the marriages that existed. And then she says, but the only one that was allowed post the Prophet, post Islam, was the first one, which was like a polygyny, was the only one allowed after that. So I think that's something I'm doing in terms of like trying to include like female voices. The other thing maybe I would point out is that temporary marriage is a very polemical topic, and you will not find, for the most part, Shias who are like, oh, temporary marriage is not allowed, or Sunnis that will say, oh, temporary marriage is allowed. Scholars, that is, at least tafsir scholars, let me like limit that. But there is a tafsir scholar, Ibn Ashur, who's a mufti from Tunisia. He's the only one I came across who said that temporary marriage can be allowed, provided it is for dire need. So I think it's really interesting that we can, in as much as I was saying that we all these scholars really align themselves with like the school they belong to and the overall thinking on the subject, but there is some divergence. And I think it's really interesting that Ibn Ashur, who's a modern scholar who died in 1973, permits it. And then I think the other thing I would say is that there are two female scholars I looked at. One I mentioned, Farhat Hashmi, who's a Sunni scholar. She doesn't have a written tafsir, but I used her audio lectures on the Quran. And then there is Nusrat Begum Amin, who is a Shia scholar. And interestingly enough, even though these are female scholars, if you didn't know they were female, you would never really, like their exegesis is not different from anything a man might say. They don't really like think or consider like what are the feelings of a woman in this, like how is a woman harmed if a woman is harmed or anything like that. And my own explanation for myself why they are unself-conscious about like lifting gender flags or gender justice is that I think like to get a seat at the table, sometimes you kind of have to just say what everyone else on the table is saying, and that's the first step. And then, you know, later women who come can be more. So those are like in the middle three chapters. These are the things I think for broader audience, I would think maybe they would find interesting.
I want to ask one other specific question related to that and kind of related to your methodology, which is to contextualize tafsir. Can you talk about the significance of the hadith or the sayings of the Prophet in producing tafsir and why it's important that you flag that as, as something we need to study alongside the Qur'an in and of itself?
So this is, like I said, when there was no genre of tafsir. So initially all we had is the Prophet said X or the Prophet said Y on this verse,
and then we had the Quranic verses.
Yeah, then we had the Quranic verses, and then scholars started doing their own sort of work where they're like, oh, let's look at it from the point of view of grammar. Let's look at it from the point of view of mysticism. Let's look at it from the point of view of law. Let's look at it from the point of view of linguistics. So all of this sort of happened later. The initial sort of tafsir on the Quran had to do just with hadith. And this is one of the things I say in my conclusion, that I think what would be a really amazing work would be if someone collected all the hadiths that are on temporary marriage and actually looked at the veracity. Because it's easy, as we know, to just say the Prophet said something. Can we determine the veracity of if that was said, when it was said, who it was said by, and so on and so forth.
Interesting. So the prophetic example was something that was taken into account in these early understandings of the Quran, which is important because I think it's a point that you come back to in your conclusion, which hopefully we'll get to. So to speak of your conclusion, your concluding chapter, you indicate that you basically make significant contributions to the field of Islamic law. You propose 4 methodological interventions. I want to ask specific questions regarding each of these. So starting with the first, could you provide additional insight into your recommendation of taking more seriously Muslim feminist works in our understanding of muta and just generally in the Islamic sciences?
So the last chapter sort of, as I said, that it's prescriptive in that it's trying to say something about how we might think about Islamic law. And one of the first things, my first intervention is that we need to take seriously what Muslim feminists have said and done. So initially in that section, I try to capture the different ways in which Muslim feminists have been speaking about our tradition. And so the way I've sort of captured is to say that the first way in which Muslim feminists are giving us suggestions and methodology is intertextuality of the Quran. So basically, in the tafsir genre, as we were speaking, classically male scholars, what they did was they went from verse to verse to verse to verse. So it was very atomistic. But what Muslim feminists are saying is that actually we should think about the Quran more holistically. Let's look at themes. Let's look at where words appear. So if you're going to talk about temporary marriage, let's look at all the verses that speak to marriage. Let's look at all the verses that speak to intimacy, that speak to love between two people. Let's put them all together and then think about temporary marriage. Another suggestion that Muslim feminists have is intertextuality, and this is where your question, your sort of point comes, that they're trying to say that actually the work on hadith is just not strong enough, that we need better and stronger work on hadith, that alongside hadith, we also need to think about there's a term that's called asab al-nazul. When did the verse come down? So think more about the description of that verse or occasions of revelation. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, which would be intertextual. The third consideration is that there are some foundational assumptions in Islamic law that relate to marriage that we might want to rethink. And this is, I want to make a point that all these Muslim scholars, they want to be continuous with the tradition. They don't want to break from the tradition, but they see that there's a lot of space where while being continuous with the tradition, you can also have gender justice. And then finally, that aside from Quran, Hadith, fiqh text, we should also look at Sufi text. And the reason why they recommend it is that Sufis I mean, I don't want to say that we're the first people, but let's say that they have this really interesting idea about understanding humans and humanity. And their idea is that gender does not matter. What matters is your behavior, your actions, your character. So I think they would be the first pre-modern to sort of talk about gender equality in a way that we understand it to be gender equality. So there are all these works that are sort of Muslim feminists have done that, like need to come together. Like it's almost to the point of being a critical mass so that it can shift things, but it's not yet there. And so I recommend that we need to take these things seriously.
So your next suggested intervention is that you mentioned is performing illegal ethnography. Could you clarify what that means? Why is ethnography important?
So I would, I'm going to, for this section, maybe read a little bit of what I've written because, so what I was thinking about is that this is a tradition or a type of institution that affects people, and that we have to take into account what people think. And when I was thinking about that, I was not just thinking, oh, let's just speak to adults or like young people, but I also think that the ethnographic work needs to be done with children, because these types of institutions, a temporary marriage that affects adults also affects the children. So that's what I mean. And then I sort of list a couple of questions that we could ask. I'm not going to read all of them. I'll just read one like small section from the ethnographic study that I present, that I say that we should follow. So there are two scholars that have done somewhat of an ethnographic work. One is Sheila Harry, she's at BU, and her book came out in 1989, where she spoke to people who practiced temporary marriage in Iran. And what she finds in her book is that some women claim that temporary marriage has a liberatory potential for women, at least women who have the same social standing vis-a-vis men. So that, it can be good for them. There's another scholar, Linda Walbridge, it's her PhD thesis. She did her PhD in 1991, and she speaks to Muslim Shias in Dearborn, which is in Michigan. And she finds that in talking to women were women overwhelmingly expressed dislike for the practice, whereas men tended to accept the practice as justified, despite no significant praise for the practice. And basically, her conclusion was that men agree that it's legally permissible, but it is not morally acceptable. So there are several questions that I say that, despite the value of these studies, I argue that both scholars fail to ask their interlocutors certain key questions and thus miss the opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of the effects of muta, temporary marriage, and its societal meaning. The first question that comes to mind is to ask the interviewers about their perception of the double standard that exists within the practice of temporary marriage. So I think one thing I didn't mention was that a Muslim Shia male can be in unlimited temporary marriages at the same time, whereas a Muslim woman can only be in one temporary marriage at a time, and she has to be a divorcee or a widow. For example, a married man may partake in the practice, but not a married woman. A woman can initiate temporary marriage legally, but she cannot pay for it. And a man can be in multiple temporary relationships simultaneously, but a woman can only be in one. Such rulings are representative of the environment they were produced in, one that struggled to even consider that men too might become so disenfranchised to want to sell their bodies for money to provide for their families, or that women too might be interested in multiple sexual partners. Questions around revoking rulings that do not allow temporary marriage on equal terms for both gender allow us to understand temporary marriage in a new light, one that has been hindered by the double standards of the past. This might tell us if this tradition has survived because of patriarchy, whereas without gender discrimination, a different ruling might come to the fore. So this is just one of the questions. I have like several questions that I kind of list and talk about in this section.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess those set of questions kind of lead us to what you're suggesting we should do as your third proposed intervention, which is that we should contemplate the social, moral questions related not only to temporary marriage, but broader questions related to marital and sexual ethics.
Yeah. So I think it's sort of important. I felt that it was important to understand that what is legal may not be what is moral, and that we need to think about what is moral really deeply as we think about what is legal. And so, for example, one question that I have here, and there's again, it's a long discussion and there's several questions. One is the question of the permissibility of temporary marriage is entangled with important moral questions. Although there are several questions, and my list is not exhaustive, I will address 7 key questions of morality in this section. First, is sexual activity connected to a Muslim's spiritual well-being? Posing this question allows us to consider the spiritual impact the body has on the soul, as opposed to conventional frameworks that examine the soul's impact on the body. If the answer is yes, then it seems reasonable to conclude that sexual activity should not be bought or sold in the way that it is in temporary marriage. But if sexual activity does not have any spiritual significance, if it is similar to being a sales clerk or a computer coder who both get paid for their services, then temporary marriage may be faultless. While we know that nakedness during sexual intercourse is physical, psychological, and emotional, is it also spiritual? In other words, can humans sell, buy, or voluntarily partake in sexual activity without it affecting the spiritual being? Is transactional sexual intimacy somewhat different from situations where we sell our labor as part of an economic transaction? Studying sexual objectification is an important development within sexual ethics, and it acknowledges that the bodily nature of sex is morally significant. We should continue the trend and develop a richer understanding of the bodily experience of sex and its spiritual significance. I was going to read another part, but I think that we are running a little bit late, so I won't do that.
Okay, so in the interest of time, then your ultimate intervention then entails Islamic legal scholars to consider more seriously research about sexuality or the science of sexuality. Could you expand on this? What does the science of sexuality have to do with how we understand and pose questions about temporary marriage?
So basically, I mean, temporary marriage is about sexual pleasure. And if something is about sexual pleasure, then we need to understand what is sexual pleasure? How does it show up in both genders? And what does the science that studies this science of sexuality tell us about both genders? So I'll give you a quick example. We know very little about female human anatomy that has to do with sexuality. The clitoris, for example, it was only discovered in 1998 by an Australian urologist, Helen O'Connell. And it was only in 1998 that she captured the entire anatomy of the clitoris for the first time. This challenges, and this, her findings challenge every description of the clitoris to date. She demonstrates not only its immense size, spanning from the front of the body to the back, but also the number of nerves it has, 8,000, 2 times more than the penis. Other studies since have shown the size of the clitoris increase as women grow older, which increases the likelihood of orgasm for women as they age, unlike men who suffer from pain, erectile dysfunction, and decrease in orgasms as they grow old. The point of mentioning this research is twofold. First, the most basic aspect of the clitoris, its anatomy was unknown until 1998, illustrating the gendered bias when it comes to female sexuality. Second, how could scholars, including Muslim scholars, understand female sexuality when even its anatomy was not understood until recently? So how does this knowledge change the way we address marital and sexual ethics? So basically, we Muslim scholars have kind of assumed at various times that either women have low sex drive or they have very high sex drive. But so we find women with high sex drive in literature other than legal literature. But when we come to legal literature, what has been enshrined is that women have low sex drive and men have high sex drive, which means that men need multiple partners and they are virile in this way. And that's why polygyny and temporary marriage exists. So we really have to kind of question these things so that then we can, like, how do we address this perception that male legal scholars have had about women? We have to turn to the science of sexuality. Not that the science of sexuality we have is the last or the final word. It is something that is developing, something that will grow, but it's at least important to take it seriously as whatever we have right now.
Right. So to better understand marriage, temporary marriage, permanent marriage, for lack of a better word, as relational, then we need to have a better and fuller understanding of sexuality in general. Do you have any final words to say about this topic?
I think, well, I won't go into like recapturing what the findings and everything. I'll just like to say that I'm so grateful for everybody that you came, and it means a lot to me. And thank you for people who are online too. Okay.
So we do have a moment or two for questions, and we have some online questions, but I wanted to offer the opportunity if there's anyone who is physically here that would like to ask a question.
Hi, Dr. Iqbal. I just want to say again, a million congratulations
for
your novel and your book and everything. I wanted to ask, what do you think the significance is for you of being sort of the first person to publish in your niche about mutais as a woman and a Muslim feminist scholar? And do you think that kind of spells a change in the field or further developments thereof?
I think I only see it as like I am kind of blessed that I was able to do this, that I had the opportunity. And like I was saying, that I think what we need in specifically in Muslim feminist discourse is critical mass. And I think I'm just one more voice. I don't think that my work is final or the best, but I think it is something that starts a conversation and hopefully other people can build on it. But I am so grateful for the opportunity to be able to do something, you know. I mean, one of the things I think when the first question remarked that I forgot to kind of mention was that, you know, I wanted to be like, when I thought what I want to do with my life, I wanted to be part of something that like continued Islam, brought gender justice. Like I saw my sisters, I see their children. Like I felt like if someone young is not part of the conversation, like religion is going to fall off the globe. Like we need young people to be part of this conversation.
Thank you. So we have a question from Scarlett Kingsley. What are the historical or sociocultural reasons behind the difference in accepting, rejecting temporary marriage among Sunni and Shia scholars?
So for Sunnis, they say that, you know, both Sunnis and Shias agree that in the life of the Prophet, temporary marriage was allowed and disallowed several times. And as Dr. Bailouni was pointing out, that every time it was allowed and then it was allowed during war and disallowed after war. And so both Sunnis and Shia scholars agree that this was the case, but Sunni scholars have decided that finally the Prophet disallowed it. And Shia scholars said that, no, we don't know if he disallowed it, and therefore it is permitted and it continues.
And Hanifa Isabella had sort of a follow-up, I think sort of similar. So I think your comments have addressed that. Dr. Beth Hackett asked, or says, Dr. Iqbal suggested that temporary marriage might provide a socially acceptable way for women to engage in sexual relationships without committing to a lifelong union. Are women today actually using it in this way?
So I do hear murmurs here and there, and it is interesting. People do turn to me. They're like, oh, like recently I had this instance where like there are two people at the Harvard Divinity School who the guy is a Muslim, the woman he wants to be with is not. So someone else got in touch with me and they were like, he's asking her to convert to become a Muslim and then be in a temporary marriage. And I'm like, I don't know. This is like, really? Like, you want me to answer this? But yes, there are young people who are. And it's not something that the community is very like open to talking about, but I hear more and more that it is being used to live together or to date or to have a physical relationship.
Roshan, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You might have already just kind of answered this, because I understood you to say that this practice of temporary marriage arose within a Shia context, but you also made a quick comment that it had shown up in some Sunni communities as well.
Yes, in modernity, there are young Western Sunni, so not Sunni everywhere, just Western Sunni, so who are using it to date or, you know,
that's what I thought, that the question you just answered might have gotten to what
I heard about a mosque in Germany that like is officially like, come to us and we will temporary marriage you.
I just didn't know if that was surprising that it was showing up in any Sunni context.
I think that there is, go ahead.
I was just going to say there are other loopholes that Sunnis have used to sort of provide a religious cover to to their relationships before they commit to an open marriage, which is to have what is called a secret marriage. So that has been used.
Misyar marriage, which would be you just say that you are married to each other, but there's no documentation, the parents don't know. And there's Urfi marriage that you kind of take part in just to travel when you're traveling, when you're somewhere else. Yeah.
Thank you.
And these are Sunni versions, I would say.
Could I ask a question? I really found it interesting that, you know, the root word for mata comes from enjoyment. So given that you've just written this brilliant book, which everyone should go out and buy and read, what has your study of temporary marriage taught you about Muslim understandings of traditionally understood marriage?
I think, I mean, it's been interesting for me to think like more about like contemporary Shia discourse on temporary marriage, and I give my hats off to these like modern Shia scholars who actually do consider that like women have sexual needs, and like if you're widowed or divorced doesn't mean you don't have sexual needs, and they sort of say temporary marriage can provide an access to those needs. I think like Dr. Beth's question, and I think it's interesting that they're at least seriously considering that men and women both have sexual needs and women have sexual needs. In like, I think pre-Islamic Arabia, marriage was a very fluid thing. And then in that fluid arena, we got polygyny, like, and some say also temporary marriage. But I think that the arc has been towards limiting like the types of so for example, in pre-Islamic Arabia, if I wanted to have a brave and strong child, I would marry someone who was known to be I would sleep with someone who was known to be brave and strong, and that type of marriage has a name, and hopefully I would get inseminated and I would have this brave and strong child, but me and my husband would raise this child. So there were all these different types of marriages, and over time I think that we have less diversity of the kinds of coupling that you could have.
Thank you.
Okay. In pre-Islamic Arabia, were there the same limitations on temporary marriage that exist now?
So, I think, I mean, it was a type of marriage. The only definition was we're both going to decide that we'll be married for 2 weeks. And if you want to extend the time, that's fine. At the end of 2 weeks, there is no ceremony. The marriage has dissolved itself. So yeah, it is an extension of the same institution, as far as we know.
Thank you, everyone. We want to make sure that you know that this book will be available certainly at the Agnes Scott College Library and at other institutional libraries. It's more of a book that is geared towards institutional libraries in terms of the price point. But there may also be scholar copies. I don't know if a digital copy is forthcoming
Yes.
Yes.
Mhm.
So that's going to be more of a student accessible thing. So just so you know, sometimes books are distributed in different ways for different reasons. So if this is in your area of research and you want to learn more, please, talk to Dr. Iqbal about how to do that. And also go to the Agnes Scott Library and get the actual physical book. Karis can order the book. It's just priced at an institutional price point. So we do not want you to be shocked. If you're watching virtually at home and you do want to get a copy, you can click that teal button. We are going to say good night to all of you, or good afternoon to all of you who are watching with us. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. We really appreciate it.